I think if the international community stopped Russia in Syria, they wouldn't dare to do what they are doing today in Ukraine. And if they do, if the war does not stop Russia in Ukraine, they will not stop there. This is not only about Russia and Putin. It's about a whole new system that Russia, China, and authoritarianism around the world are trying to build to push back against the democratic war.
Okay, let me try. I think I got it this time. I'm going to screen share and pick. Do you see our homepage?
Yep.
Okay, so over here where it says resources, and then Ukraine and Russia, and this is just from 2022. All these things, you can click on these links, a lot of good people, many from Ukrainian and translation. We've been working on this for a while. So we go back all the way to 2014, and then even some stuff about the Stalin and what they did in the 30s and so on. So that's a good place to find some good sources of information. And I'm going to stop the share.
There's also Novaya Gazeta that won the Nobel Prize is definitely a good place, but they've been kind of shut down. The other guy is he's actually been arrested now too, is Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was poisoned by Putin. But there are some good Russian sources that are worth to the degree that they're still functioning. That's usually a good place. But there is this, again, I apologize. I'm going to try to get you the name of this woman in Kharkiv that is, kind of a venerable journalist who does a lot of in-depth human rights research and investigation.
And if you look in the chat, I think people know how to do that. Alex put in some names. I'm going to put in Oz Katarji, I think it is. And I think he's in Kiev, or he was.
He's in Kiev, yeah, and like he's really good. Oz is really good.
Yeah.
He's there.
Next question.
Arwa had her hand up, Stan.
Okay, Arwa, if you could unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for holding this. And I've just listening to my husband speak in the other room. So as I was listening to the conversation, I did want to just kind of cue him or prompt him to comment on something that I found to be quite interesting. He just got back from a trip to Berlin to visit his family, where they have been relocated because of the war and the destruction of Yarmouk camp. And so anyway, so he was visiting them, and it was his first trip to Berlin. And, it's an interesting time to be in Germany. Germany has a very, different relationship with Russia than the United States does. And we've had conversations with his brother and his brother's girlfriend about the role that the U.S. is playing in arming Ukraine. And, there are a lot of people who are quite critical of the United States for perpetually, for our military industrial complex and all of the military, assistance and aids and weapons that we produce and sell and manufacture, and all of the correct things to be mad about, because it has not been used necessarily. It has been used on it has not always been for the better or for a good cause that we have, built these relationships with countries and sold weapons, et cetera. And so now, a lot of people are watching the U.S. do this with the Ukraine and there's criticism of U.S. policy, and there's criticism of the U.S. doing this. And, we've had to argue in different occasions, well, what's the alternative, right? If we don't do this, then Ukraine is gone. And I think that that's pretty clear. And it is, and this is what I've argued, but I would just ask, Nizal to comment on this because he was there, and I find it interesting because Germany obviously has a very different relationship with Russia, and Germany's a lot closer. The war feels a lot closer. There are Ukrainian refugees now in Germany, and anyway, I'll stop talking, but I just think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from Nizal on that piece, and sort of the international perspective, or the Western European, or maybe just the German perspective on what we're doing to aid this the war.
Okay, Nidal, if you could unmute.
Yeah, I cannot not answer my wife, actually. This is not an option. No, actually, I wish that I could stay more in Berlin, because, Berlin is really cosmo. It's like you meet people from everywhere in that city. And I was telling Stanley earlier before this that it's one of these times that you find yourself just defending the United States in these situations. And literally what I had to do for maybe 5 or 6 days there, that to go into conversations about war and defending the US policy by sending all these weapons to Ukraine. What I would say briefly that, of course, people are with Ukraine and they have this, they don't feel that Ukrainians are like strangers or refugees. They are Europeans, they are in their homes, etc. Not in a racist way, actually, as sometimes it was seen like as opposed to the Syrian refugees, or that of the wave of refugees 2014, 2015. Of course, they are welcomed in Germany, maybe around Europe, but of course, there is this phrase that you will hear it from everyone. There is an ocean between you and Europe. You are US, is not Germany. And once this war starts, no one can stop it. And I felt it's just a feeling. It's not based on any like study or any scientific opinion, that I just felt that people, okay, this just pause for now. Getting Ukraine to join the NATO and the European Union and just stop this war and start from there, discussing with Putin and with Russia. There is this opinion across Berlin, I would say, at least. It is very interesting, and it's not surprising actually, because war is bad in general, whereas like I don't want to sound radical, but whereas here, like when Arwa and I discussed this, we are ready to go for a third world war, frankly. We have to defend this world. We cannot just see countries collapsing one after another, genocide after another. Otherwise, what's the meaning of never again, right? But like people inside the war, like in the war, who like war is close to them, I think they have the right to express themselves this way. I don't know if I could give an answer.
Thank you. James Van Pelt, if you could unmute and ask the next question. James is our president of Promoting Enduring Peace.
Well, I have many questions, but I would like to home in on the significance of the sanctions. It seems to me that if the sanctions made a significant contribution to frustrating the Russians, that means that there's a non-military way to wage war, and that would be a great step in a progressive direction. But my question is this: there are like two tracks in terms of what's being done by the Ukrainians. One track is about howitzers and javelins and hardware and explosions and blocking missiles, and very, very much of a hardware orientation. Then on the other hand, we have elaborate efforts to make the sanctions powerful. And so my question is it possible for a non-hardware solution to make a significant contribution against a group that is shooting missiles at Ukraine?
Alex, could you start off?
Yeah, I think the sanctions package is a very creative way, and I think history will show that the work that the Biden administration did in developing broad sanctions and escalating sanctions was a very creative and innovative and in some ways brilliant technique. In some ways, it begs a previous issue, which is how in the world did the West allow all of these oligarchs to buy all of these villas in London and on the French Riviera and flood, Trump Towers in Miami with, Russian oligarchs and their families? And I mean, how did we allow this level of money laundering to happen? And I think something that if, assuming that our democracy survives the 2024 election, I think that's something that Congress really will need to address, is like, how is it that everybody from Deutsche Bank to, so many, hotels and industrialists in this country allowed themselves, and how did our government allow the rule of law to be so eroded that these oligarchs were able to run wild with this level of money laundering? So it's wonderful, belatedly, that the sanctions are working, and I think they're taking a real bite out of the oligarchs. We're already seeing that to some degree, but I think we need to revisit that issue and figure out how do we protect Western democracies against the influence. Certainly something like Citizens United also. I mean, we've seen a flood of dark money coming into our political campaigns. And a lot of that's been coming directly from the Russians. I mean, and both, in terms of $93 million purchases of properties by, an oligarch like Rybolovlev in Fort Lauderdale that Donald Trump boasted about. I don't know, $93 million. That's pretty good walking around money if you want to be bribed by a Russian agent. We've got. Anyway, so I do think that sanctions are an important tool that need to be further strengthened.
Now, Nadal, I understand you have a different point of view on sanctions.
Oh, yeah. So today the State Department issued a statement about an estimation of the wealth of the Assad family in Syria, and it's between $1 to $2 billion. Maybe the situation would be in Russia different, but there is something, it's definitely not different between Russia and Syria, that this kind of regimes, they have a mafia style regime. They always have a way to move around their money, and what we have seen in Syria, that these sanctions, especially like the large sanctions that was designed against Syria itself, not against Assad, it really hurt the normal people in Syria more than the regime itself. Actually, it enriched the regime. They increased their wealth because they are they are merchants in this situation. They trade. They benefit from these sanctions by generating more wealth. But what I support definitely is targeted sanctions. sanctions that would target the oligarchs in Russia, the oligarchs in Syria, the oligarchs in Lebanon, the oligarchs everywhere. This would be more useful. Because what we've learned in Syria and also now in Russia, like there is a big part of Russians they support this war against Ukraine, and I don't think that pressuring this Russian people would make them change their mind. They did not. Putin has been in power for 20 years, and he changed the mentality that Russian thinks. It's not Boris Yeltsin anymore. It's not this democratic dreams anymore. It's like people who live under autocracy and they think the same way. And I don't think that hurting, like sanctioning and squeezing the economy of the Russian ordinary Russian people who live mainly in the east, not in the cities, will change anything. And maybe Alex, he knows more than me, like about the Russian, like the Russian people, how they live in different cities in east and west and north and south.
Yeah, I'd agree that targeted sanctions are very important, and yeah, to just punish the whole population is not the right approach to take. So to the degree that oligarchs really can be targeted and that their ill-gotten wealth can be expropriated legally, that's the way to go.
I don't see
Just I
any-
wanted to, I
Oh, go
just
ahead.
to add one thing very quickly. The Congress issued. I have to check a new law. It's called the Sambar Vendi Law, which is like, this is a new sanctions law, which is different than Caesar bill. And this Sambar Vendi, who is like, actually he's a friend here in DC and a former Syrian diplomat who defected, and he suggested that instead of making these sanctions across the country in Syria, it should be targeted against certain Syrian personnel in the regime, and this is what, how, and actually it's effective. It's really effective.
Okay, I want to be devil's advocate in it because there's a fellow who Democracy Now! Brings back to talk about the situation. I'm not precisely sure about how to pronounce his name. It's like Levian. And he's with an institute that was started by Soros and one of the Koch brothers. At any rate, he talks about, well, now there's a danger that this is a proxy war, that the US is getting the Ukrainians to fight to weaken Russia, and that they're getting that the US is fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, meaning, it's not something Ukrainians want, but they're being manipulated. Alex, what would you say to that?
The Ukrainians certainly don't feel manipulated at this point, but that doesn't mean they're not being manipulated, right? So I think that's a stretch in the sense that the Ukrainians really are acting out their will. The bigger question is, for instance, Zelensky in some of the appeals for negotiation has said that he's willing to forego NATO membership, for instance, for the sake of bringing the war to a close. So he's open to that, at least, he's declared that much. But I think that, there, in many ways, I think a lot of the countries in NATO see this as Ukraine fighting the war for the protection of the rest of Europe, to stem the tide of Russian aggression and Russian imperialism into the Baltic countries, Poland. Already Moldova is on the chopping block as far as what Putin and Solovyov have already declared. So it is the flip side of that is that I know we all tend to be pretty critical of NATO in many ways, but looking at it objectively, NATO really has preserved the peace in Europe for well over 70 years now, with the exception of Bosnia. And in Bosnia, NATO did play a role in I would argue, bringing that conflict to a close earlier than expected, and probably saving more lives than would have been spent. So, we kind of take it for granted that France and Germany have been at peace for the last 70 years. I mean, they were at war constantly for centuries, and it took a lot of very careful craftsmanship and diplomacy to bring that to a close. And even with countries like Hungary that are now taking a more fascist, I would argue a more fascist turn, NATO has not really interfered. I mean, NATO hasn't said, Orban, that there needs to be regime change in Hungary. So I haven't seen NATO really interfere in other nations' business within the NATO bloc. So those are all kind of counter arguments to that issue of a proxy war. But I think, the Ukrainians definitely see themselves as fighting for their independence. This is our fight. We're not asking anybody else to fight this for us. All we need is the hardware. That's their posture. And I think most people in the Ukrainian American community concur.
Okay, we've been going at it for over an hour. Before we get to the next question, I just want to talk about things coming up. And one thing that Promoting Enduring Peace is doing to deal with the terrible situation in Syria, particularly the question of prisoners. There's tens of thousands of prisoners in Assad jails in unbelievable conditions. And there's also thousands of children. And we're highlighting the case of one family, the Al-Abbasi family. In 2013, the mother, who had been a chess champion of Syria, and her husband and 6 children were just taken in the space of a couple of days and have not been seen since. So we are going to be highlighting that story on May 14th. We're going to have an in-person meeting with people participating over Zoom from other countries. The event will take place in Connecticut in Old Lyme at the First Congregational Church around 1 o'clock. So that's a bit of a commercial there for that upcoming event. And we think it's really important to take a big issue like prisoners and then, focus it by looking at one particular case to show the real horror of it. Alex, maybe you could tell us about some things that are coming up, either educational events or charity or fundraising, I should say, or protests.
Thank you, Stanley, for that opportunity for a quick commercial. There's a lot going on this weekend. There's going to be a concert that I found out about today in Stamford, and I can't remember the location. I can send that to you if you could share it with the people that are on this call. We've also been in touch with people. The Polish community, as you might imagine, has been very supportive of Ukraine, and they've already sponsored a couple of very successful charity concerts, one in New Britain, and there's one that's being organized in upstate New York in Millerton, and possibly at Bard College, that would be June 4th. But there's a lot going on. There's also tomorrow, Wesleyan University is having a wonderful, they've had a series of these noontime programs with guests from Ukraine that are actually in Ukraine, either in embattled cities or working on relief efforts, including this one that I just found out today, that this group of Yale doctors are planning to actually go to Bucha and meet with children that were traumatized or witnessed horrors there. So that's happening tomorrow at noon. And I can send that out to you, the invitation by Professor Barry Chernoff, who's putting that together with people at the All Britain Center. So that's just a quick survey. Just keep your eyes peeled. There's always amazing activities going on, but those are the ones that I can share with you for the short term.
And we have what we call the Action newsletter, and we send it out about once a week, and so we could tell people about these things. And we have everybody's email. We'll put you on the list. And you could find out about these events, things coming up for Palestine, and also Syria and so on. By the way, one of your pictures made me feel a little funny. using the Israeli flag as representative of Jews. And there's a lot of controversy about that. In
Sure.
fact, I took part in a campaign called Take Down the Israeli Flag, but that's another story. How about the next question? We have time for a couple more questions. I guess James again. Go ahead.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, if you don't like a certain kind of sanction, if you object to it, tell us what the alternative is. If you don't like the president and his programs, tell us what your alternative is. Because we know what's going to happen in November, or what could happen, and on the 2024.
Mhm.
Which person would you like to answer that, James?
Well, I had another one to tack onto that, which is 43 million Ukrainians. It seems like they could field a much larger force than Russia can march their troops into Ukraine. What's wrong with that idea that they should be able to come up with 10 million boots on the ground?
Ukrainians themselves should come up with 10 million boots on the ground. Is that
Well, I mean, that what they want is weapons, which implies if you had enough weapons, you could get 10 million.
Yeah.
But what's the upshot of that?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the Ukrainians are facing a much larger population in Russia, that you basically have maybe not an endless supply of boots on the ground that Putin can re-enter into to throw into the battle. So Ukrainians are limited, and out of the 42 million, they've already lost 5 million people as refugees, and it's, again, this is why the no-fly zone is such an issue, because it's not just the Ukrainians probably could hold their own as far as pitched battles with infantry and sieges, bunker kind of warfare. And they did very well in 2014 and 2015, actually pushing back the Russian troops from control of about 20% of Ukrainian territory to only 7% of territory in southeastern Ukraine. So they can hold their own, but if you get into a war of attrition that lasts longer than a few months, even a few weeks now, we're seeing the devastating impact on the economy. About half of, I could tell you offhand that probably even though they haven't been affected physically by the war, for instance, we actually had, our university had more than half of its funding was coming from indigenous Ukrainian business leaders and philanthropists. I mean, there was a culture of philanthropy developing in Ukraine that was quite robust and quite healthy. Almost all that's gone. I mean, there's only a handful of businesses in Western Ukraine that can still sustain that. So there's a lot of, in a long-lasting war, Ukraine is definitely at a disadvantage because Putin can just keep conscripting people and throwing them into and he doesn't care. I mean, he doesn't mind a meat grinder, as we've seen already with the careless deployment of troops that he's had, even at Chernobyl, where they were digging trenches in the Red Forest and all these guys got contaminated. Putin doesn't care. So the Ukrainians, the numbers are somewhat limited. And the other danger there is that, when you're looking at the Baltic countries, again, they're NATO members now, but that's a much smaller population. And you don't want to get into a situation where Putin says, okay, I can't defeat the Ukrainians. Let me just throw boots on the ground and just overwhelm Estonia and Latvia. So that's just my kind of gut reaction to that, James. I hope that's somewhat responsive.
We didn't talk, we talked about nuclear weapons, but we didn't talk about nuclear power. And that's certainly a whole big aspect of this conflict. Just 2 days ago, Zelensky said that the Russians shot cruise missiles over the nuclear power plants in Zaporizhia. I'm sure I butchered that word.
No, you got it right.
Oh, okay. They were aiming for part of the city. So they said, all right, let's just shoot the stuff. Can you imagine if the thing failed? Rockets fail all the time. If it failed and it hit the nuclear reactor, I mean, it's crazy.
They did bomb. They bombed the atomic energy station at Zaporizhia, and fortunately, the containment held. Back in the early days, I think this was like March 2nd or 3rd, that when they were in the neighborhood of Zaporizhia, they actually launched, they launched rockets and bombs against the atomic plant. So, I mean, it's kind of crazy that they were either the troops were oblivious as to what they were doing, or these were intentional strikes, or as you say, Stanley, they could have been accidental strikes, but the result could have been just as devastating from an accident as a deliberate attack. So, no, it's deadly serious. And you've got four nukes at Chernobyl, one of which is now completely contained unless it's disrupted. And then you've got Khmelnytsky has a nuclear plant. I mean, yeah, that's a whole other nightmare scenario that could play out.
Any more questions? We've been at it an hour and a half, which is pretty long for a Zoom. Megan, would you like to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for your time and for hosting this. I'm just curious about what we're going to do about the left, and if you guys have ideas for all of us small people in organizing and how we build solidarity, international solidarity, and kind of grapple with the ways in which people who are our natural allies on the left are really undermining Syria and Ukraine right now.
We're gonna fight the gray zone. This is, we have to. Like they are really out of this world. This propaganda that they are leading, the gray zone is like really leading it and very strongly. And I think just fighting the propaganda that they are promoting should be our mission here in the US. This is how I feel about it, actually.
And we can't get sentimental. I wrote a very harsh article criticizing Noam Chomsky, and he's a guy I learned so much from.
Sure.
He taught me about Palestine and Israel in 1982, and I interviewed him, and I followed him for years and years, but he's leading us down the wrong path, and a whole bunch of other people. And we just, we're talking about thousands of lives. You can't be sentimental about that stuff, and so you got to take them on. And we are certainly been doing that in promoting enduring peace, and other people have been doing that. And,
No, Stanley, I applaud the fact that you are, this is no time for us to get locked into, ideological silos and think in 1980s terms about what's happening today. I totally, would agree with Noam Chomsky about, the way that the U.S. really did horrible things in Latin America, for instance. He educated me a lot on what I visited El Salvador. The war crimes that were committed there are just horrific, and so. But I think in this case, to your question, Megan, I think that this is a pivotal point where I think the left in this country can really challenge both the right and the left, in the sense that, you're really looking at Putin as a force of fascism. In every respect, this war is a purely fascist war by every definition, in terms of its contempt for human life, its contempt for ethnic diversity, cultural diversity. It is a full-bore attack on not just Western values, but liberal and leftist values. And Ukraine, Ukraine really has been fairly agile in the way that it's adopted some of the best ideas from left, center, right. They're not dogmatically bound, because Ukrainians have suffered across the political spectrum. They were occupied by the Nazis. One of the most brutal occupations was in Ukraine, and the Soviets. So they've seen both sides of it, and they've seen how ideological ruthlessness can turn ideology into kind of a horseshoe, where all of a sudden, it's like you end up actually the two extremes look awfully similar. So I do think that the left does need to take a serious look. On the other hand, this is a great time to really expose the fact that you've got expletives deleted, but people like Tucker Carlson and Pat Buchanan and like all these old Reagan Republicans that used to be gung-ho about beating up on the Soviet Union suddenly are hopelessly in love with Putin as the defender of, I don't know, power politics or brute politics, or barbarism is all of a sudden in vogue among the American right wing, even when it's being practiced by Putin. So I think this is a great time to really expose and target people like Tucker Carlson and just say, this guy has zero integrity, zero respect for human life or democracy, and out these guys and come at them hard.
And I'm putting in our one of our emails for PE Peace. We would like your help. Speaking to everybody, get in touch with us. Join in various projects, suggest things for us to do. But we do have to try to change the left consensus, because we know we're a minority position on the left. But if this doesn't reveal the bankruptcy of that stuff, I don't think anything will. And we don't have time. Climate catastrophe and collapse is right around the bend, and we don't have time to fool around, even with genocides. So we have to move on. So, well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank our speakers again. Oh, we do have a question. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So I definitely agree that there is a concern with Russian influence and infiltration in leftist media sources. That is a real issue. But I would like to know why Noam Chomsky would be under that influence, because as someone, or maybe a different influence, I don't know, but what would be his motive of misportraying the situation? Because he is someone that is obviously, a very established, has a very, respected reputation. So what would be his motive to do something like that?
I think, we were raised in Syria reading his books. And sometimes I wonder if Edward Said was alive, what would his position be these days? I think I think Chomsky and big part of the left are really stuck in a corner in the ideology, and they don't want to realize that this world has changed, and ideologies change, and countries and societies change, and it's not freezing or frozen. I think this is Chomsky's problem, and the problem of a huge range in the left. I think so.
And I would say it's not a matter of integrity. I mean, some people in the gray zone, I don't think have integrity. But Chomsky, I don't think is like that at all. But I think he's seen things as they were 10, 20 years ago, and is really kind of a campist, if people know that term. This idea that the US is one camp, it leads the imperialists, and then everybody else is a good guy. And boy, that's not the way the world is.
And that never used to be his approach. And I mean, for instance, Noam Chomsky spoke very eloquently about the Stalinist terror in Ukraine and the Holodomor. He's very, I mean, I always respected him for that reason, that he was to me, he seemed like a fair arbiter of denouncing human rights and genocide, regardless of whether it was committed by left or right. I mean, I also don't question his integrity per se, because I think he tries really hard to say the right things and to be on the right side. But in this case, we just agree to disagree. That I think, what may have applied to Middle East politics at one point, or in Latin America or Central America, may just not apply in this situation. And he, as an anti-fascist, I think should be adamantly opposed to, whatever Putin stands for, and also to stand up for the ethnic integrity of various, groups, minority and majority groups in Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Armenia or Georgia. So I do think there's a blind spot there that's very unfortunate.
Nina, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I noticed that Noam Chomsky from the very beginning, when we started hearing Putin saying that he has rights to his near abroad, which would be Ukraine, that Ukraine couldn't do this or that, Ukraine's sovereignty was very limited by Putin's need for a near abroad to make him feel safe. And Noam Chomsky bought that argument that Putin had a bigger right to feel safe than Ukraine had to sovereignty.
Right.
And that just seems so unethical it's such an unethical argument to buy, but he bought it right away. And I guess because there's this the NATO background. And if you say NATO, then right away, that's the enemy. That's the real enemy. Putin must be a real, the victim of this enemy.
Yeah. And sadly, he shares sort of strange bedfellow status now with people like, Pat Buchanan and Mike Pompeo and, people that I'm sure would turn his stomach in any other situation. And I do think that, the whole idea of neutrality, I know 10 years ago, I met with the Costa Rican ambassador in Washington and wanted to sort of forge a dialogue with Ukraine to see, like, how did Costa Rica manage to be in a very violent neighborhood in Central America and still be so peace-loving and so committed to nonviolence and non-aggression toward its neighbors. But I think, Ukraine has always been in a tough, it's the toughest neighborhood in Eastern Europe. It's always been, whether it was the Mongol invasions or the Ottoman Empire, it's always been a sitting duck for imperial ambitions. The other piece of this is that, and I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a professor earlier today, who said, for years, for decades, East European history has always been taught through the Russian prism. The Russian perspective was the dominant perspective. That's an imperialistic perspective. There's a lot of countries out there that have, there's maybe a couple of Polish studies programs in the country, one here at Central Connecticut. There's one Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute who, between us, has done a pathetically poor job of representing Ukraine's interests in the broad, in the American mainstream. I think they've really failed, other than promoting, awareness of the Holodomor. I think they've really fallen asleep on the job. But that's an old Yale criticizing a Harvard outfit. So anyway, but I do think that there is a need, and what's been happening since the war broke out is suddenly around the country, people are scrambling. Where is the Ukrainian perspective? Why have we never heard it? Because they've always been pushing it through Russian studies programs. And so I think that has crippled a lot of attitudes and an objective approach to it. But yeah, the one approach is the Noam Chomsky approach. The other one is Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger was the guy who believed in spheres of influence, and people are entitled. We're entitled to dominate Latin America, and so Russia's entitled. That's garbage. From a human rights perspective. And so it's interesting that you've got these strange right-wing and left-wing bedfellows that suddenly buying into this crazy theory that has no place in the modern world.
Any last question? Let me get to the gallery view.
I just want to thank you, Stan, for setting this up, making this great discussion possible. And I'd be interested to know if other people feel this is valuable and we should keep doing it.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
If you think it was a good idea, just write your name on the back of a $50 bill, send it to.
Not 50 rubles, please.
All right.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you,
keep
Stanley.
looking
Thank
at
you
our
all for,
website, and hopefully we'll see some of you on May 14th in Old Lyme, and have a good evening.
thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Vidal.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Stanley.
Thank you, Alex.
God bless.
Bye.
Yep,
Bye.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.